Good evening, everyone. We're very happy to welcome you at the Center for Urban History. Within our lecture program, which is dedicated to the issues of World War I. Our lecture program is a part of a broader educational program that has been on in the Center for Urban History for about 1 year. In December last year, we launched the exhibition on World War I. It is still open, and you can find it in the basement of the Center for Urban History. So I want to encourage you to visit this exhibition. And within this exhibition program, we organize tours and excursions on the topic of World War I. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome Katharina Haberkorn. She came here within the residence grant, and she's working here on her PhD research. Katharina is a PhD candidate at Andrássy University, Budapest, and her dissertation is dedicated to the topic of commemoration practices after World War I, which is the topic of our lecture today. The lecture will last for about 45 minutes, and then we will have some time for questions and answers, for discussion or comments. It's a great pleasure for me to give the floor to Katharina. Should you require interpreting, please fetch headphones. I really hope that you like this lecture.
Thank you for this introduction, and thank you for the invitation also. I'm really pleased to talk to you today. I hope you all had good holidays and you start full of power and energy to the new year. We have a lecture tonight, and I will talk about spatial order and commemoration practice after World War I. And I already realized that I should have had a longer title, because I will just present you... Louder? Okay. I will just present you a case study of the Bukovina region in and after the World War. So I don't have to emphasize the difficulties of practices of commemoration. It's a huge topic, it's a big field, and yet it is highly visible still in our times. But we still have to deal with a gap between commemorating events on, for example, the Western Front and the Eastern Front. Part of this distance is grounded on the very position of us here in Lviv and the former lands of Galicia and Bukovina. There are many buzzwords for the region. Tim Snyder called it once Bloodlands, and other authors, among them Omar Bartov, called it Shadow Zones of Empire. It is a region where many things got lost, systems broke, and a lot of mass violence and destruction took place. I like especially the second term more, and especially to begin this lecture with. What we see when we look on commemoration practice on World War I is, first of all, the ruptures. Many things, lives and systems broke, and it took a long time before we take up the fragments again and try to bring back piece by piece an understanding of our past. And I really deeply consider this our past, because it is deeply European at its core and also in its afterlife. I will not go in chronological order tonight, and I will not stay only on the Eastern Front during World War I. In fact, I go all around Europe, I make several stops, and I consider European developments in commemoration and city planning of different aspects, because many of these events are very European rather than limited or specific national. But we will end for sure in the region of Bukovina, and I present you some of my case studies and findings so far. I will start with the pictures soon. But the field is literally confusing, because the changing front lines several times, changing borders afterwards, huge losses and destruction. Let's find a way through. And I start symptomatically with death and all its expressions in public space. I created this slide you see already as a cover with two almost iconic images. The background image was taken in late 1915 in Galicia, in fact. And the smaller one is it was taken during the commemoration activities around 2014 and 15. And it's an almost ideal memorial setting. It is a stone carved with names and a poppy flower, which has been in the press recently rather often. It's a long way from picture A to picture B, not always straight and not always well documented, but we try to get there. And the poppy flower brings me already to the British Commonwealth War Graves Commission. I will talk about them a little later because some of their ideas concerning war graves and soldier memories became almost universal, especially the poppy flowers, which we see now everywhere when we speak about the First World War. My ongoing research as a PhD thesis observed the cultural heritage in Bukovina, Ukraine, so only the northern part of the Austrian Bukovina. And I observe most of all material culture which can be found in monuments and tombstones on the cemeteries of the region. I will show how the understanding of a state, the statehood in general, public order have turned into material forms. Monuments with their cultural manifestations show the importance of heritage sites in consolidation and or mobilization of societies. Heritage sites and monuments support national ideas and political ideas, combine attention on one place, and not only mourning as part of their obligation, also adaptation of official languages, symbols and cultural codes is important. Monuments, including tombstones as a basic form, are of great importance because they not only show what should be remembered for future generations, but also the ideas from those who planned and created them at a certain time. In addition, they are linked to different narratives and political debates in their surrounding. It is important to note the difference between the concrete place of the monument, its location, and the space in which this expression of culture exists. Among other monuments, as part of a narrative in public space of a city, where many different layers of culture come together. Public order translates here ideas of power and statehood in vision. Space is therefore no empty box to fill, but rather a strategic business. We have to work on a contextually of an understanding. We have to work on an understanding of space contextually. And now we start and go to the Bukovina, but not for the First World War, but to the recent events. And it happened that among the Maidan shootings of the recent revolution here were citizens of the city of Chernivtsi among the dead. And their burial back home was with great state honor, and the mayor and many officials and many public attention was pointed to this funeral. So we have the dead bodies brought back from Kiev to Chernivtsi to give them a proper funeral, and the long street leading to the central cemetery in Chernivtsi was till 2014 named after the Red Army. It was the street of the Red Army, but when they came home and were brought to the cemetery, the street was renamed in the street of the heroes of Maidan. And because the heroes of Maidan were brought towards the cemetery, and so this city is part of this ceremony as well. And I have a quote which is 100 years older, and I would like to read it to you. It's from this British statesman, William Gladstone, and he pointed really exact the idea of this whole renaming. Show me the manner in which a nation cares of its dead, and I will measure with mathematical exactness the tender mercies of its people, their respect for the laws of the land, and their loyalty to high deeds. So, death and its representation mirrors central developments in state affairs, and the cemetery can therefore be understood as a smaller version of urban space. I understand cemeteries with Michel Foucault as other spaces. They are marked with a fence or an entrance gate or something similar, because we, as a modern society, we divide the dead from the living, but they are not gone. In fact, cemeteries are in various aspects part of our daily life, our rituals, our communication, and they're only on a special position within society. Everything behind walls and fences is part of current reality too. It is a real place and an imagination at once. Alternative behavior, a variation of time, like a minute of silence or something else, and regulation of access can be named as determined, but they don't mark these places as completely strange to the surrounding. That's why Foucault called it heterotopy. They act as spaces among other spaces, but they are in a relation with them. And it's important to get the idea of spatial constructions and fences, as you will as an example, because it's the simplest form of spatial construction in urban space. You just have a fence and you mark visible, me and the other, inside and outside, here and there. It's an important sign for orientation, but it's also an expression of hierarchies. It's highly visible. And power is here understood as the power of definition. Who's inside, who's the other, what is outside, and how does it define myself and my position. The production of space is important in modern society, and especially in fragmented societies. They emphasize unity on a common belief, and to analyze the production of space is important to understand the structure of settlements, concrete expressions, but also the social processes behind. It connects the very first picture tonight. The graves of the Maidan activists on the central cemetery need to connect with the city space. The long boulevard towards the cemetery is as much part of this ritual as the flags and the flowers on the graves. The city needs central points of attention. The need for representation goes hand in hand with orientation and order, as I mentioned before, even more in highly fragmented societies. And this is why I choose Bukovina. We have here a map of Bukovina around 1900, and it is highly fragmented, just very obvious because it's a very colorful map already, and the colors indicate many different people's religions and confessions and others. It is an area marked by cultural diversity, a variety of languages and religions. It was part of the Habsburg Empire since 1774-5, and when the Austrians arrived here, they found a little known and sparsely populated area, which they wanted to develop in order to secure their eastern border and to have new contacts and new impulses for trade and traffic. And so the city of Černovci, back then Černovic, became a regional center little by little for commerce, for governance, for cultural life and education. And according to the census of 1900, it was inhabited roughly by 30% Romanians, 40% Ukrainians, and 27.8% of other ethnic and cultural backgrounds. Among these, Jews made up the biggest group. For the capital itself, Černovci, in 1900 were 67,200 inhabitants registered, of which 21,578 were Jews. So it is a highly diverse population, and we can note only by the numbers that Orthodoxy and Judaism were highly visible and present in daily life. Bukovina was a borderland in which many religions, nations and languages met. However, in the southern part, which also marked the city of Suceava, which is today Romania, the ethnic Romanians dominated and numbered more than half of the population. The infrastructure was growing since the Austrians governed this area, but not yet very strong. Vienna supported organization and invited settlers to move to this area. During this politics of settlement and growth, first public monuments appeared. If there were any before this time, they were more in parks and churchyards and private backyards, but not that visible. But in the 19th century, they appeared on the public space, on the big streets. And there were three, but I have only two pictures here. The first one, which I marked because it's rather small. It's Mother Mary, it's Pietà, and it's a cross just vis-a-vis opposite of the city hall. And the other one is the allegory of Austria. It's the female representation of the state of Austria, which was, they were built in the second half of the 19th century. And the third one was a soldier monument of earlier Austrian wars, where Bukovinian soldiers were among the soldiers as well, which was built in 1902. And I have marked the positions of these monuments on a map of the inner city. So you see those three dots, and they were really visible and distinctive and big for the time, and there was nothing else surrounded by them, to them. So the statue of Austria and Mother Mary were obviously signs of the state of the Habsburg Empire. So it's Catholicism and the state of Austria. And the soldiers represented loyalty to the state. These three very distinctive markers were visible whenever one was moving around in the central city. And also the dead were already under state control. It was part of the state politics in Austrian lands since the 19th century to organize the space for the dead on behalf of the state, formally because of hygiene, but soon they realized the power of representation of these centralized places. In Černovci, the new cemeteries were built in 1866, and it was the first time they were both on the same street, just opposite one another, the Jewish and the Christian one, both in close neighborhood. And so the cemeteries too became a playground for the new needs of expression and representation, and soon the Great War added new layers to this aspect of spaces, to the city, to the inner city, and to the cemeteries as well. Now we're coming closer to the soldiers, and commemorating the dead in a political context is relatively restricted by the means of the monuments. They are quite similar and change little over time. For a long time, only generals and commanders and royals were remembered publicly and had the privilege to sit on a horseback of stone or on a pedestal, standing over everything else. But in the late 18th century and in the 19th century, more and more people were involved and also shown. What these monuments have to tell is relatively easy. They're just built to make sure that the message gets across. Mostly they deal with solidarity, loyalty, courage, help, and similar topics. You might have seen some monuments like this. These are random monuments. I have chosen for the First World War, but regional random. And they are widespread, and I guess all of you have seen them, but they are not the immediate responses to the war. They were the result of negotiation. They were result to resources available and to official support if needed. But not everywhere and not everything was very neat and organized from the very beginning. So some images and places developed over time and were enlarged, rebuilt, destroyed, whatever. And therefore we need the cemeteries to double check the situation. They just give us a clue of a more immediate response. There's no such thing as authenticity in this field. We still have to deal with this nice term of emerging communities, but it is just the one side with the other side is incomplete. We need just both sides of one medal to understand, to get the whole picture. And the cemeteries in World War I became a major issue simply because of the high number of victims. There were some incidents before which resulted in greater action of commemoration, but they were not really organized on a big scale and they disappeared sooner or later. The First World War created cemeteries like this, and Fabian Wehr had, I will quote Fabian Wehr, a war that had been fought on an unimaginable industrial scale had been commemorated in kind. That's an expression, and I think this picture fits to this expression. Fabian Wehr was a journalist and a volunteer to the Red Cross on behalf of the British Army in the First World War, but soon after he arrived in France as a soldier, as a Red Cross soldier, he started making lists for the dead and fallen soldiers, and he registered the burial places. In 1915 already, his lists were so long that he hardly worked on anything else, only just to complete his lists. And his considerations were the foundation of what we now know as the Commonwealth War Grave Commission. And it is still active today, but it had its great times like long before. And some fundamentals, some principles of their work became widespread in all competent nations, copied them. And these are, each of the dead should be commemorated by name on a headstone, by an inscription on a memorial. The headstones and memorials should be permanent, the headstones should be uniform, there should be no distinction made on account of military rank or civil rank or race or breed. These are really nice words, and these values and aims remain as relevant now as they were almost 100 years ago, and they speak of the need of a commemoration practice which covers everybody. Because the war took longer than anyone expected at its beginning, and the high losses it provoked, the cemeteries became more important and reached high emotional and official attention. There were places for mourning, but also places to collect and support moral strength of the fighters, to create solidarity and call for further action too. In times of war, in the Great War in particular, visual attention tends to combine all state narratives on soldier cemeteries. The same was for the Habsburg army. In the end of 1915, the local command of Krakow created a department for war graves, where central registration, transport and burial should be organized next to the building and the design of those cemeteries in quote-unquote a proper commemoration system. From this local command, the War Ministry in Vienna accepted the ideas and implemented them for all territories later on. They soon published some guidelines on how to build a soldier cemetery, the size, the format, the symbols, and some help to adjust with local laws concerning land and cemeteries and stuff. In times of war, hunger and great chaos, one cannot expect to find construction material that easy. That's why they just adjusted to what they found and what they had. But the guidelines in general called for a quiet but serious architecture and the adaptation of local conditions. This could mean an enlargement of existing cemeteries or an entire new place where certain features could be found. It really depended on the area where we look on. So I just mentioned the central points of the War Graves Commission, like the headstones should be uniform, there should be no difference in ranks and other stuff. And already by these also random pictures, but already from the right region, we see there are big differences, and some lay in mass graves, and some have metal crosses, and some have wooden crosses, and so we already see some differences, but everyone, almost everyone gets a name and gets a place to be remembered. The region of Bukovina was before World War I not involved in any war by the Austrian-Hungarian Empire directly, and it was not touched by hostile groups prior to 1916. When the Russian Empire entered the war, things changed rapidly. The war front swept over the region several times, and especially in June 1916 began the major offensive by Russian troops on the Austrian eastern border, and the cities from Lutsk in the north to Bukovina in the south, Černivtsi and Suceava, they were all been taken by the Russians. At this point also Romania entered the war, which was until this point not a combatant nation. And so Bukovina became a major battlefield of this war, and this is also a fact which makes it a shatter zone. In 1918, when the Habsburg Empire collapsed, the region was overtaken by Romania, which also changed the general frame of remembrance in an already fragile region. So the changed national and soon nationalistic setting, as well as the missing connections to urban features, became clear very soon after the war. The regional capital of Černivtsi had, by the end of the war, 2 mass graves with fallen soldiers, because there was no time and no space left to bury them properly, so they were quickly buried in a mass grave. And they were temporarily marked with simple signs, but no headstone and no monument or no cooperative design, whatever. So first of all, they were mass graves. But on this picture we already see some workshops of the war grave commissions by the Austrians. And it's from the newspaper, so the quality is not really good. But we see only crosses, that these are large numbers of crosses. As I mentioned before, we had Jewish soldiers, Orthodox soldiers, but now we have only these crosses, and they were delivered rather slowly. So then we have the mass graves, which were temporarily marked and not finished within the war and after the war. The Romanians had no interest in marking those mass graves properly. Plus, they were both placed on the Jewish cemetery. And the Austrians just finished one monument, a small one, and it was placed on the Christian cemetery after the war, but in already 1918. And it is quite near the entrance of the Christian cemetery. It's rather a simple stone with an inscription of 1914 to 1918, heroes of the land, loyal to the dynasty and never to be forgotten. But there are no names on the stone. So again, we have not a commemoration for any single soldier, but for the army in general on the Christian cemetery. Those concrete fallen soldiers, they lie unnoticed on the Jewish cemetery. And the old authorities were no more responsible to watch the design of the memorials until the end of the war. And the new authorities were not really interested, and they were more interested to show their own victory and to identify with the new territory. So on the place where I showed you previous, the statue of Mother Mary, stood now the soldier of the Romanian army, and he's a big man with a weapon in his hand, and it's the monument is called Unirea, which is unity, and it was erected in 24, and yeah, it stands also, it is the strong hero soldier which holds up his weapon, but it's also the unity monument to the reunited Romanian lands, and it's now the central figure in town. There was an epitaph, a list with names of the fallen soldiers, later appeared in the 1920s as well in front of the Protestant church in Czernowtsi. So there's also no connection to any other monument, because it's rather on the outskirts of the city, and it's a minority church among other minorities, but still. But just we have this soldier in the center of the city, so there's no room for fallen soldiers anymore. Later, also beginning in the 1920s and fulfilled in the 1930s with private donations, the mass graves finally got a design. So there were private people donating materials and headstones to mark those mass graves on the Jewish cemetery, which is the first one on the right side is to the Russian soldiers, the Muslim Russian soldiers, which have fallen in the Battle of 1916 in this area. They were placed on the Jewish cemetery. And the second one is the Jewish soldiers of the Austrian army. And they are both not in the entrance zone of the cemetery, but far away on the almost on the back side of the cemetery. So it says a lot about, you know, the connection and the location of this memory. The memory in general takes place without connection to other features in public space, and one can say it's almost a counter-memory. It's just half a century too early before this term was coined. All monuments were far off the city center. I marked already the city center. And they were behind the track lines, the thick black line you see there is the trail tracks. So we have the big man with the weapon in the city center, and we have the names on the church, which is on the outskirts, almost like near the tracks. And we have the cemeteries with the mass grave and the official Austrian monument. And we should quick have a look in the second largest town in the region, which is Suceava. It was not the representative center of the region, and it was mostly Romanian anyway. So the effort to market Romanian was not so urgent after the war. So the first monument, which appeared directly after the war, was made of wood and stood on a central position on the cemetery, on the Christian cemetery. You see very well that it is really in a central position. Many ways lead towards the cemetery. You can reach it from every position you enter this cemetery. And it worships the heroes of the war and their fallen comrades. Later though, there appeared the guy with the gun here too, but he covers already two wars. And the black on the ground, the bronze one, is for the Second World War. And again we see interesting separate designs on the Jewish cemetery, which are also dedicated to the Jewish soldiers of the Austrian army. And not only because of their lack of space or material, but because next to these really heroic images, there's no space for these minority monuments. I don't know if you can see this on the small stone. Yeah, there's a hand with a weapon. Like it is really, the stones are written in Hebrew, but the numbers are 1914 to 18, and there is one hand holding a sword or a big knife in the hand. So they are active soldiers on duty, also with weapons. So we have many conflicting points in commemoration practice, which makes it even more complicated to look in this region. We have, most of all, the state as a first point and a first actor. I have just pointed out we have the preliminary guidelines in how to commemorate war dead. We have general concerns about design of public space, and we want no doubt in the predominance of certain beliefs and public ideas, if not ideals, in public space. And second, we have the society. We have the situation of war, an unimaginable scale, producing hunger, homeless, orphans, and leading in the end to a completely new state and the collapse to the old system. Most people were just busy with coping. So one thing which is obvious in looking on the monuments of the time, it's the ruptures and the shadow zones of the area in general. And the need for representation is very high in these fragile zones and these highly diverse zones, but the scars of the collapse is nowhere as visible as here. And let me finish with the picture I started with, and with, again, a quick outlook and my personal beginnings. The preliminary commemoration practice and some of the unfinished monuments are today accessible for researcher. Among other things, this is because we use archives easier and libraries in different countries and so forth. But the main reason lies in nature itself. That's one of the tragic points of history. Because of the latter events of the Second World War and the death of the Jewish communities, mostly in this area, cemeteries were abandoned too. So they were overgrown, almost like forest. You might have seen some of those. I was a volunteer myself many years ago and cutting trees on one of those cemeteries in Bukovina, and I was astonished and bewildered of what we could see again. Luckily, some of those speaking stones are visible again. They were forgotten and they were overgrown. And we as researchers, as well as local residents with 100 years distance, can look back in time, and if nobody is left to talk to, we have to rely on the records. It has been a long way from this initial picture to a heroic image we have nowadays from the war. And therefore it is good to have some locations and stories to challenge this big man with the weapon. And finally, the final image is from a commemoration practice last year in Great Britain, Birmingham, where a local artist formed an army of ice soldiers and let them melt in the sun. And she said it's an ephemeral but forever changing visual. That's the beauty of it. I think that's a very European approach to the war and to the commemoration especially. Memory is not fixed. It can't or it shouldn't be, but we can grab the few items left and challenge one-dimensional stories. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katharina, for this great lecture and for sticking to the time limit. And now we have some time for questions and answers. Should you have any questions or any comments, you are more than welcome to ask them or make any comments that you might have. Just one request, please introduce yourself before asking your question, because we are recording this lecture and it's very important for our recording. So any questions, comments? While the audience is thinking, I will allow myself to ask a number of questions. My first question will be of general character. Jay Winter, who wrote about commemoration practices, considered the commemoration culture in the broader context of the modernistic culture and culture in general. And he said that the commemoration practices of World War I set certain standards for the commemoration practice in the 20th century. My question is as follows. Do you agree with this statement, and is it relevant for the Eastern Front and for the region of Bukovina? And my other question is related to the current reality. The monuments that we have left in the region of Bukovina, the monuments, memorials, or cemeteries that we have left in the region of Bukovina, are they incorporated into the modern commemoration practices in Ukraine or other countries of the world? And if yes, how are these commemoration practices different from those practices that you mentioned that are peculiar to the Western Front? And in general, when we're talking about monuments to World War I on the Eastern Front, are they incorporated into the commemoration practices in other countries? Because I think the situation in Eastern Europe is very different from the commemoration practices in other parts of Europe, and the attention that is paid to monuments to World War I in Eastern Europe. So these are my questions.
I answer this one and then hopefully there's more. Yeah, great questions. That's really, we could fill, I think, the whole evening. And Oksana and I talked already about the First World War before I had this lecture here. And so we agreed earlier that there is a need especially to talk about World War I in the Eastern region, on the Eastern Front, on the former Eastern Front. Yeah, start with Jay Winter. It is, I would definitely agree on this fact of standardization. Yes, but it is difficult to, as I mentioned, it is not a one-dimensional way of this commemoration process. So when we have these big soldiers' monuments now commemorating the First World War, they are not much different from the Second World War. I just been recently, in the first weeks of January, I've been to Berlin and visited the Treptow Park, where this big huge Soviet cemetery lies with 7,000 or something soldiers buried there, and this huge soldier on the head. It's the same visual, it's the same story behind, but you can also look at the memorials on the Battle of Waterloo. You also see in 1815, or if there's something left in the Crimean War in the 1850s, and you have some of these visuals just becoming clearer and clearer, and they don't change that much since the time. Is it relevant to the Eastern Front? Again, yes and no, because the destruction which followed later in the 20th century was so huge that we don't have that much left, unless we have some forgotten sites, as I have just pointed out on the cemetery. But for example, the Romanian soldier is gone. Lenin took his position later on, and other monuments are gone too. So it's difficult to talk about the commemoration on the Eastern Front in general, because it's very special in every region, and there are so many layers now on top of this of these memorial sites. So we really have to dig deep before we can have a big image on what is commemorated here on the First World War and what has been added later. Yeah, the question of incorporation is also really important, I would say. It needs to be incorporated in the bigger picture. It's really needed and it's really urgent, but it's not. I'm afraid to say, it's the Eastern Front is still, as I experienced it as a student myself, the Eastern Front is still far, far away from the official Western historical narrative. Yeah, so we have to challenge it. The center in Lviv here and some of the researchers and coming researchers, yeah, it is still relevant, and I think we agree on the relevance in general of the First World War for everything what happened later. So it is good to go back to its roots, and it is deeply European in its roots and it's in its afterlife. So we have to challenge also this Western European narrative.
Дякую. Чи є ще якісь питання з залу?
Are there any questions from the audience? I think that this issue of commemoration of World War I on the Eastern Front is not only something that should be considered in the context of Ukraine, but also in the context of the neighboring countries. I think it's the same in Poland. This issue of commemoration practices on the Eastern Front is not really highlighted and focused on in Poland. Recently, we discussed some other issues that are related to the commemoration practices of World War I, and in 2 months, there will be a large-scale international conference in Paris dedicated to the rethinking of World War I and the commemoration of World War I. There will be another international conference in Dublin in the summertime. It's very difficult to predict the specific topics that will be raised during these conferences, but practice shows that the Eastern Front is overlooked and neglected during such international conferences. And even though the Eastern Front was a major battlefield and front line, unfortunately, it's very often neglected during research projects and international conferences. I think that when we're talking about the region of Bukovina, then we commemorate the Січові стрільці and some other pages of our history more than the events of World War I. But what is interesting here that the Eastern Front is not only about Ukraine and Ukrainians. Maybe I am getting distracted a little bit, but still I want to raise some of these issues from the viewpoint of commemoration. The Turkish government is planning to hold some large-scale commemoration events for the front line that covered the Ottoman Empire. But once again, it's related only to a very narrow context. And I think that we will not really talk a lot about these events in Ukraine. I also have a question related to the local population that live among all these monuments. What is their attitude towards all these places and sites? You mentioned the Muslim soldiers and officers that were part of the Soviet army. What about the local population? Do they have some local events that are related to the commemoration of World War I? Not only the commemoration of the fallen Ukrainian soldiers, but also those soldiers that were a part of the Soviet army or the Austrian-Hungarian army. Or maybe for the local population, these monuments do not really exist on the global map.
Again, really interesting. And yes, well, how to tackle these, how to tackle these social and emotional relationships. First of all, and especially in my region, in the Bukovina region, it was, I think there are some specialists, of course, they were always considering First World War as a major event of the local history, but in general it was not much and not widely debated. But in the early 90s already, the Austrian government paid some workers and had some commission, a special commission for this soldier cemetery sent out to those former Austrian lands and to check up the war graves, the former Austrian war graves. And I think this was an initial event for some of the local residents too, because they never thought of going to the Jewish cemetery because it was so overgrown and it was abandoned and nobody took care of these places. And then a foreign commission came and started to cut trees and to make things visible. They were not visible for a long time. And so it was with local knowledge, of course, but those foreign commissions and workers giving an impulse to look in your own area and to your own past, which is really important. There was no commission by the Russians so far to look on their graves, and I think it's important. I don't know much about general the caretakers of the Russian Imperial Army, but I think it's a fact that these Muslim soldiers are not really on a high priority to whatever is considered heritage tourism. And so it's, so we have these foreign elements, and we have a region which was highly affected by the Second World War. So more than half of the population disappeared, was killed, was deported, was gone after the Second World War, and new people arrived to this area with no relationship to this very land. They just were coping with the situation. So it's not really, there's nobody to blame that this heritage was lost, because the people were also, they mostly were gone, those who knew about those places. And so it's, as I said, there are many layers to this monument discussion. But now, I said, with 100 years distance, I think we can, as researchers especially, but also as highly interested residents, we can challenge our own past and look a little bit closer to those regions and to the outskirts of our city. Maybe there's something left, or maybe there's something disturbing, and then look what is disturbing there. Yeah, and your first question, I'm also really curious every time when I read an announcement of a conference, if there is something to hear about the East. Usually it's not. As experience showed, I think we both made the experience to sit on the conference and be like the exotic birds talking about the Eastern Front, and others talk about, I don't know, France and Belgium and whatever. And of course there's more material, the same as I said before, because many things are broken and left and lost in this region. So it's really difficult and tiring, and it's based on tiny work to collect the material in many languages. This is also a fact which complicates the whole business. Like I just cover 10 or 12 years of city development and change languages 4 times. And this is not a really lovely subject to historians and political scientists, but with those findings we should go to the conferences more.
Дякую, Катерина. Чи хтось має запитання? Софія?
Any questions? Sophia had a question. My name is Sophia Diak. I have two questions. One question is about the distance. If we have a look at the graves in the region of Bukovina, where did those fallen soldiers come from? So basically, I mean, the distance from the country of origin or the place of origin and the burial place is very big. Is this distance big? So were there reburial practices in those times? So what was it common practice to maybe find remains of bodies and then rebury them closer to the places of origin? I know that things like that took place after World War II, but I'm not sure whether it was common practice to after World War I too. So basically to bury bodies closer to their places of origin or in their countries of origin. And the other question is related to the question asked by Oksana. It's a question about local communities. Can we provoke some sort of empathy or responsibility on the part of local communities, responsibility for the dead ones, or basically empathy with the dead ones that are not really part of that local community. They are strangers, basically. And what was the role of the church in religious institutions in this process? Not just the role of the governments or those states that do not exist anymore. And not just the role of international humanitarian organization, but what was the role of the church and religious organizations? And one more question is that this period of the Eastern Front, when World War I ended, those monuments to the dead ones that were created after World War I. So basically, these local monuments are part of some other conflicts, but it's just a matter of chronology, because we have one system of chronology in the Western world, but then we have a different system of chronology on the Eastern Front, because basically sometimes we even have different definitions of when World War I ended.
Thank you again for the questions. Yeah, where did the soldiers come from? I mean, obviously these Muslim Imperial Russian soldiers did not came from, you know, the neighborhood. They came from the Caucasus region, and there was no exhumation, and I don't know of any existing lists who lies there, in fact. There's even a dispute of the numbers. There's, you know, like in approximate number, but I doubt that there's a real list for this Imperial Russian grave. The Austrian Jewish soldiers were mixed, of course, but they were from the eastern regions. They were from Galicia, and even some from the Bukovina, but mostly from the more Polish regions. But just the fact that so many soldiers were killed during the events of the war, the reburial was not really considered, because it was already really difficult to organize those graves and those mass graves or personal graves on this place where they were killed. And it was in fact also an idea of, it was to help the living soldiers, because the First World War the front was going back and forth several times, and several times there were dozens of people killed on the same space, on the same spot. But on this spot people had to grow vegetables later on this year and get some water out of the river. So those dead bodies need to be removed as quick as possible to make sure that you can use this land when this battle is over again. And so it was a highly practical reason to make central burial places, and so it was on the same time as practical not to go back and get them home again, because it would be too many and too much effort to have the lists again and the address or whatsoever. Yeah, I don't know if this really matters, like closer, if they were closer, if they were from the neighborhood, if this meant automatically that people would relate to them easier. I don't know, and I doubt this, but who knows? we cannot know. But the events of the war were felt and realized by everyone in this area. So it doesn't matter if your neighbor lies in this grave or some strangers, because we all, or the people of the time, all experienced war, and some survived and some not. So the connection is the topic of the war and not the origin of the soldiers, I would say. And reburials is really a topic of the Second World War, or the post-Second World War, more than it was for the First World War. Yeah, the governments, you said already, there were no states left to manage those things, and the new states were not really interested anymore. The churches are really interesting, yeah, on several points, because we have this Jewish, for example, the Jewish soldiers in the Austrian army, and they have been rabbis and officials in the army too, to take care of them and to relate to them during the war. And they also took care, at least partially, of the burials themselves. But it was largely based on private initiative. So it was not really organized, at least it's not noted in any document. It is noted that they had services and they helped the families and whatever, but it's not, there's no guideline how to do and how to react or whatever. Yeah, the question of chronology, yeah. It is, the monuments, most of the monuments came like 6, 8 or 10 years later to the end of the war. So there is much time passed, and time for negotiation, time for collecting resources, and time for setting up new ideas completely. But some connections, not always, but there are some connections in the design, because they are the same sculptures for the stones on the cemeteries and the big monuments. Because the losses were so high, there were just a couple of artists left, and they did everything from personal gravestones to big monuments. So we have personal connections to the artists sometimes not. And the artist cannot really negotiate on the design, but he can add something or leave something behind and make his personal stamp on it. So this is interesting to follow on a really small level. And yes, and then they speak of all the new fragments and new conflicts rising in society, and they are like, I understand them sometimes as time, like little spaces of time where time is frozen, and we just open it again and see. So okay, in the 1920s it was post-war and pre-war at the same time, and you see already the cracks in the fragment of society in those time capsules. Yeah. And stop here.
Дякую. Чи в когось, можливо, є якісь ще коментарі?
Are there any other comments or questions? If there are no other questions, or there's one question. There's one question. You're welcome. Андрій Морочинський, in your opinion, all these monuments that commemorate World War I, what is their cumulative effect? I mean, are all these monuments, were they erected to deny the war, sort of, or maybe they are a ground for another war? Maybe they are used to cultivate this sort of attitude that a war is something customary. Well, if you're killed, then you will be buried, you will be commemorated. So it's normal practice. I want to add to this question because I think it's very important. So the monuments to World War I in the region of the Bukovina, are they tools for commemorating the dead ones? Or maybe they are used more as sites of glorification, in particular when we're talking about national monuments, like monuments to the Polish soldiers or Romanian soldiers. Well, I understand that it's very difficult to say what their specific function is, but in your opinion, what is the major function of all these monuments? To commemorate or to glorify, to cultivate this attitude that warfare is customary?
If I may, I just go a little circle before I just come back to the question. I don't know if you followed the Nobel Prize lectures this year, 2015. The Nobel Prize for Literature was handed over to Svitlana Alexievich. And usually it's the tradition that the Nobel Prize winners, they give a lecture the day before the Nobel Prize is handed over at the Stockholm University. It's almost as important as this lecture here, I guess. And in this lecture she really nailed it for me. It's really important, and you can find it published on the internet. It's she explained how her motivation of writing, and she said we grew up learning to love the man with the gun in his hands. So that's one of the central sentences she used to describe her motivation. So there was nothing else to see for her growing up in a city which is now called Ivano-Frankivsk, and later on living in Belarus. And because there was nothing else to see, just the guy with his weapon in his hand. And I think it's really, it's fair enough to ask state or society or ourselves why and how we commemorate things. And it's the same question now in 2016 than it was in 1916. And there is always, I would say personally, always there is a part of instrumentalization. There is some sincere sense of commemoration, of honoring the dead, but this would be, you know, the social cemeteries, those uniform, never-ending lines of gravestones, but there would no central monument in the city center be needed. So, of course, they are part of political communication and political articulation, and they are instruments for whatever. I think it's a little bit too hard and too much to say it's the cause for the next war, but it's building up a foundation. If you grow up seeing the man with the weapon, of course, the military action is already within society, and it's not something strange to you, you know, to have military action considered in the argument rather than diplomatic or whatever actions. Yeah, why did this? Well, it's a why is that we have this kinds of commemoration? I can go back to the Roman Empire. Since we start to have these faces on the coins, the Romans put their faces. The Roman Caesars had their faces on the coins spread around their populations to make sure that every single citizen, no matter where they live, they see the emperor in their daily life. And it's a kind of a bounding, I would say. So we have those memorials, especially the big ones and the more distinctive ones, to make sure that everyone sees the emperor or the state idea or whatever is shown, to make sure they know what they live for, or to communicate state beliefs and state ideas. Any tools for commemoration? That's enough.
Are there any other questions? Because it takes some people more time to think of good questions. Your last chance. There's one more question. My name is Olena Fomina. Currently in Ukraine, there are a lot of cemeteries that were constructed in the wartime, but a lot of these cemeteries were destroyed, and we have parks or some other buildings in their places. Does it make sense to install some sort of commemorative plaques or signs to inform people that there used to be cemeteries on those sites? What is your opinion?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And if I would be mean, I would ask you right back: is it necessary, or is it useful for you to have this signs of commemoration? If I don't know if you're aware with the commemoration, the stepping stones in Germany, where you have in front of houses of deported Jews, you have the names written down. You have now in St. Petersburg, you have the последний адрес, the black on the doors where Jews were deported, but it's very recent. I think 5 years or something. I don't know, but it's so you have something. Mostly for deported Jews, to indicate where they come from and where they went. But for me, I look at those stepping stones or on the name tags on the buildings. I don't think many passers-by do this, and sometimes it's even difficult for me, knowing Eastern Europe, and you stand in front of a house and reading, I don't know, a name written there, and he or she was deported in 41 or 42 to the ghetto in Minsk. What the hell is Minsk, and where was the ghetto? And if I go to Minsk myself, I cannot find the ghetto because there's nothing indicated. So this is already, with the existing memory debates we have, it is good that we have such stepping stones, and to wonder what happened with all our neighbors and all our citizens, where have they gone? But the other end is not marked. So if I don't know where the ghetto in Minsk was, I cannot follow the traces of my neighbor. And the same is for the cemeteries. I say, because I like cemeteries, I say we should indicate them and find pictures and frame them and hang them in schools and in the city hall to just remember how the city looked like and how the cityscape was designed. But, well, first of all, it's a question of documents. We don't have documents of all sites, and sometimes it's only a plan, a map, a drawing. Sometimes it is pictures, which is helpful. So there's some practical aspects, but then if we have the documents, we really have to think about a broader practice, because then we also have to change maybe the textbooks in school, and we have to open an exhibition on the First World War, like this one in the center, and we have to, there are many things following. So then it's the question, what for? And if we just have this one exhibition here in the center for the First World War, and nothing else would happen in the city, no research, no books published, no nothing, it would also be a dead end. So we need a whole circle and a whole system of commemoration to make those places real, because if you just have one sign and one location and nothing to connect to, it's an empty, yeah, it's a one-way street with no end. And yeah, if we have a handful of historians and a handful of social activists to create a public space to commemorate those places, that would be great, and I definitely would support it. I would be the volunteer, but it really needs a handful of people. And then I would really, honestly, I would be interested in your opinion. Would you like to make it happen? Would you be like the social activist to support those ideas? Any of you, if you like? If not, it's okay.
Дякую. Чи є ще запитання?
Are there
коментарі?
any other questions or comments? My name is Tetiana Olinik. To what degree such commemoration practices, because you mentioned some of the traditions dating back to the Roman Empire, to what extent are these commemoration practices are correlated to the Christian tradition when you have some tombstones basically on the stepping stones to the church or the temple, and it's a sign of humility and modesty, and basically if this sign gets obliterated, gets erased over time, then it means that that person can finally find peace in the other world. So do you think that there's correlation between the commemoration practices that you mentioned and the Christian tradition of commemoration? I cannot hear it. It was more of a comment, maybe not a question. If there are no questions and comments, then I want to say a big thank you to Katharina for this great lecture. And I want to point out that this topic is still quite unresearched indeed, not only in the Ukrainian context, but in the context of the Eastern Front in general. You also need to remember that because of the complicated Carpathian terrain, it's very difficult to access some of the monuments and cemeteries because we have some very rough terrain in Ivano-Frankivsk and Transcarpathian regions. At the end of June, we are planning to organize a workshop on the topic of World War I, and we are going to have a tour to different monuments commemorating World War I, and we are only at the preparatory stage of this tour, and we can already see that it will be very difficult for us to access some of the monuments commemorating World War I. So thank you once again, Katharina, for having raised this important topic. Once again, I want to remind you that our exhibition is open from Wednesday through Sunday, and every Wednesday we have an excursion of the exhibition. So we will be happy to see you during our next lectures. Thank you.